30 pounds of custom-machined titanium feels like an anvil when your knee is screaming and your lungs are starved on thin mountain air. 3,000 meters. That was the gap between our shivering hide and the heavy gun chewing our boys to pieces. Command called it a mathematical fantasy. Impossible. But she just racked the massive bolt, freezing metal biting into her calloused thumb. She wasn't some mythic angel. She was just exhausted, freezing, and dangerously good at physics. Granite dug into Corinne's sternum. The ledge was barely wide enough for her shoulders, an uneven shelf of slate and damp moss jutting out over a sheer drop that vanished into the grey soup below. Her chest rig, weighed down by extra magazines and a bulky radio, pressed against her ribs with every shallow breath. The air up here was thin, sharp, and tasted faintly of ozone and crushed pine needles. She shifted her left knee. A dull, grinding ache radiated up her thigh, the remnant of a bad landing in a blacked-out helicopter 3 days ago. Or was it 4? Time had blurred into a continuous loop of marching, hiding, and shivering. Behind her, Finnegan let out a slow, controlled exhale. The sound was barely a hiss over the wind, but in the tight confines of their makeshift hide, it sounded like a blown tire. "Stop breathing so loud, Finn," Corinne muttered, her voice a dry rasp. Her throat felt like it was coated in fiberglass. "I'll just stop breathing altogether, Corey." "My bad," Finn whispered back. His voice lacked its usual sarcasm, flattened by the altitude and the bone-deep cold. He shifted his weight, the Gore-Tex of his jacket scraping against the rock. It was a loud, synthetic sound that made the hairs on the back of Corinne's neck stand up. "Watch your gear," Carter hissed from the far side of the outcrop. The team leader was a dark, huddled mass against the shale. He had been staring through his spotting scope for the better part of 2 hours, his eye socket bruised from pressing into the rubber cup. "Sound travels." Corinne didn't reply. She pressed her cheek against the cold, wet stone, letting the chill seep into her skin. She was tired, a heavy, leaden exhaustion that settled in her marrow. Her boots were soaked through, her toes numb blocks of ice, and there was a localized, stinging pain in her lower back that screamed every time she tried to straighten her spine. This was the reality of the teams. The recruitment posters never showed you lying in your own filth for 72 hours, nursing a bladder cramp, waiting for a target that might never show. The fog rolled over the ridge in thick, wet waves. It wasn't a gentle mist. It was an aggressive, suffocating blanket that left a sheen of moisture on everything. It clung to the barrel of her rifle, a massive .416 bolt-action beast wrapped in disruptive pattern tape. The weapon was heavier than a sledgehammer and about as comfortable to carry up a mountainside. She hated the damn thing. She loved it too, in the pathetic way a prisoner loves the cell wall they lean against. But right now, looking at the moisture pooling on the scope rings, she just felt tired. "Echo 26 is still pinned," Carter said. His voice was a tight, controlled wire. He was listening to the encrypted comms traffic through his earpiece. "They're taking plunging fire from the northern ridge. Heavy machine gun, DSHK, maybe a KPV." Finn crawled forward, dragging his Kestrel wind meter and ballistic computer. "Air support?" "Grounded," Carter replied, not looking away from his optic. "Ceiling is too low, fog is too thick, artillery is out of range, and mortar tubes are empty down there. They're stuck." Corinne closed her eyes. She could picture it. The guys down in the valley, huddled behind inadequate cover, maybe a crumbling stone wall or a shallow ditch, while 12.7mm rounds chewed the earth to powder around them. She knew the sound those rounds made. a supersonic crack followed by a heavy, mechanical thud as they struck meat or dirt. She knew the smell of the dust kicked up by the impacts, choking and dry. A wave of nausea rolled through her, brief but intense. It wasn't empathy, it was muscle memory. "Distance to the northern ridge?" she asked, her voice flat. Carter finally pulled away from his scope, rubbing his eye with a dirty, gloved hand. He looked at her, then down at the valley, then back at her. The skepticism on his face wasn't hidden. It was etched into the deep lines around his mouth. "Don't even think about it, Hayes. It's out of bounds. Distance, Mitch," she repeated. She didn't use his rank. Up here, on this miserable rock, rank was just a word. Carter sighed, a ragged sound. Laser rangefinder couldn't even punch through the mist earlier, but based on the map data and GPS, it's 3 clicks, 3,000 meters, give or take 50. Finn stopped messing with his computer. He looked up, his pale blue eyes wide, the grime on his face emphasizing his hollow cheeks. 3,000? 3 kilometers? "Yeah," Carter said. "Which means we sit tight, we observe. If the fog breaks, we relay coordinates for when the birds can finally fly. That's it." Corinne didn't say anything. She slowly, agonizingly, pulled her right arm back, reaching for the bolt handle of the .416. The metal was freezing. It felt right in her palm. The familiar knurling dug into her calloused skin. "Hayes," Carter warned, his tone shifting back to commander. "Leave it. They're taking fire," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If we sit here, they bleed out. You know what a DSHK does to a man hiding behind a rock? It doesn't care about the rock. It turns the rock into shrapnel." "I know what it does," Carter snapped back, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "I also know that taking a shot at that distance, in this weather, is a waste of ammunition and a good way to give away our position. We compromise this OP, we're dead too. There's an entire company of hostiles sweeping the lower basin." "Then I won't miss." She said it without arrogance. There was no swagger in her chest. Honestly, her stomach was doing flips, and she desperately needed to pee. The thought of calculating the firing solution made her head throb. But a cold, mechanical detachment was already settling over her, dulling the pain in her knee and the freezing wetness in her boots. It was the shift, the psychological click that separated Corinne, the miserable human, from Hayes, the firing mechanism. She dragged the rifle forward. The bipod legs scraped against the stone. "Finn," she said, "get on the glass. Give me a reading." Finn hesitated, looking between Carter and Corinne. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind howling through the crags and the distant, muffled thumping of the heavy machine gun echoing up from the valley floor. It sounded like a giant beating a dusty rug. Thump, 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 Carter glared at her. "You pull that trigger, and you miss, you're answering to the brass, if we survive the extraction. If Echo 26 dies, there won't be anyone left to care," Corinne replied. She settled the buttstock into the pocket of her shoulder. She adjusted the cheek rest. The cold rubber numbed her jaw. "Finn, now!" Finn swore under his breath, a steady stream of creative profanity, but he slid up beside her, deploying his massive spotting scope. He twisted the magnification ring, his eye pressed tight to the ocular lens. "I can barely see shit through this soup," Finn muttered. "Fog is dense out to 800 meters. Then it thins out over the valley, but it's rolling. The target ridge is... Wait. Okay. I have a thermal bloom. Faint. Northeast face of the opposite ridge. Looks like a fortified bunker. Sandbags. Camo netting. I see it," Corinne said. She was looking through her own scope, a high-power variable optic that cost more than her first car. The glass was immaculate, but the image was a watery, trembling mess. The heat radiating off the valley floor, mixed with the cold air and fog, created a chaotic mirage. It looked like she was trying to spot a target at the bottom of a fast-moving river. The radio on Carter's chest crackled again. Taking heavy casualties. Medic is down. I repeat, 2-6 is pinned. We need immediate suppression on that gun. The voice was panicked, laced with the ragged breath of a man who knew he was cornered. Carter keyed his mic, shielding it with his hand. 2-6, this is Overwatch. We copy. Weather is holding off air. We are attempting to secure a firing solution. Stand by. Carter looked at Corinne. You have one shot. One. If you don't hit the gunner or the weapon, they'll know exactly where it came from. The echo off these canyon walls will paint a giant red target on our backs. Understood, she murmured. Her thumb flicked the safety off. A tiny metallic click that sounded deafening in her own ears. All right, Rain Man, she said to Finn. Give me the bad news. Finn was already tapping frantically on his ballistic calculator. Distance is 3,012 meters. Angle of fire is -4 degrees. You're shooting slightly downhill, which helps, but not much. He paused, looking at the numbers on the screen. He shook his head. Corey, this is stupid. Read the numbers, Finn. Flight time is going to be roughly 8.4 seconds, he said, his voice tight. Do you understand what that means? In 8.5 seconds, the target could stand up, make a cup of coffee, and walk away before the round even gets there. He's behind a mounted gun. He's not moving, she said. Wind. Finn held up the kestrel. The little impeller spun erratically. Here at the muzzle, it's a full-value crosswind from the left, about 8 miles per hour. But looking at the mirage down in the valley, he squinted through his scope. It's reversing, right to left down there, and there's an updraft riding the face of their ridge. Coriolis? She asked, shooting east to west. The Earth is rotating toward the bullet. You need to account for elevation drop. Spin drift is going to push you right. Aerodynamic jump from the crosswind is going to push you down. Finn rattled off the variables, his tone shifting into the robotic cadence of a spotter, doing math that defied common sense. Corinne reached up and began twisting the turrets on her scope. Click, click, click. Each adjustment felt heavy. She was dialing in an absurd amount of elevation. The reticle moved so far down, she was basically looking at the top edge of her scope housing. Hold left 3 mils for the wind, Finn instructed. I'm guessing the wind in the middle of the valley is dead. The updraft on their ridge might negate the aerodynamic jump. It's a crapshoot, Corey. It's an educated guess, she corrected, though she knew he was right. At 3,000 meters, the bullet would go transonic, dropping below the speed of sound before it hit the target. When a bullet breaks back through the sound barrier, the shockwave destabilizes it. It can tumble, veer off course, or just drop like a stone. She was relying on the custom-loaded, solid brass, lathe-turned bullets to maintain their ballistic coefficient. Her heart hammered against the granite. Thud, thud, thud. It was too fast. The adrenaline was a toxic spike in her blood. She needed it to slow down. She closed her eyes. She focused on the smell of the damp earth, the sharp tang of the pine. She felt the rough texture of her gloves. She forced her lungs to expand, filling her belly, holding it for 3 seconds and letting it out through her nose. Target is firing again, Finn said. Corinne opened her eyes. Through the scope, she saw the muzzle flashes, rhythmic, angry orange bursts tearing through the grey haze. The thermal bloom of the gun barrel was glowing white-hot. Behind it, a dark, indistinct blob. The gunner. "I see him," she whispered. "He's tucked in tight behind the receiver," Finn said. "You have to thread the needle, hit the receiver, and you might disable the gun. Hit the sandbags, and you just make him angry." Corinne didn't care about making him angry. She adjusted her breathing. The crosshairs floated. They were bouncing slightly with her pulse. She needed the pause, the natural respiratory pause at the bottom of an exhale, where the body is perfectly still. "Send it when ready," Finn said softly. The sarcasm was gone. The hesitation was gone. There was only the spotter and the shooter. "Mitch," Corinne said, not moving her lips. "Plug your ears." Carter didn't argue. He pressed his hands over his headset. Corinne exhaled. The air left her lungs. The crosshairs settled, hovering precisely 3 milliradians to the left of the glowing white blur, aiming absurdly high above it. Her finger, stiff from the cold, touched the curved metal of the trigger. She didn't pull it. She increased pressure, gram by gram. The wall of the 2-stage trigger broke. The .416 roared. It was a violent, concussive blast that tore the fog apart and sent a shockwave slamming into the rock walls of their hide. The recoil punched Corinne in the shoulder with the force of a swinging bat, driving the buttstock deep into her collarbone. Dust and loose shale rained down on her helmet from the overhang. The muzzle brake vented gases backward and sideways, kicking up a blinding cloud of dirt and pulverized moss right into her face. She tasted carbon and grit. She didn't blink. She rode the recoil, forcing the massive rifle back down, driving her eye instantly back into the optic to follow through. "Shot," she grunted. "Tracking," Finn said, his voice strained. The silence that followed the gunshot was agonizing. It wasn't actually silent. The echo of the blast was still rolling like thunder down the valley, bouncing off the granite faces and multiplying until it sounded like an artillery barrage. But in Corinne's mind, everything had stopped. 1 second. She imagined the massive bullet tearing through the thin air off the ridge, spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. 2 seconds. Her shoulder throbbed. A sharp, hot pain that told her she was going to have a bruise the color of an eggplant by tomorrow. 3 seconds. The bullet was crossing the valley floor now. The crosswind would be pushing it. Was it 8 miles an hour? 10? If the wind had gusted while the bullet was over the gorge, it would be blown 10 feet off course. 4 seconds. Corinne realized she was holding her breath. She forced herself to inhale, a sharp, ragged gasp that tasted of gun smoke. 5 seconds. Did I jerk the trigger? The insidious thought crept in. Did I anticipate the recoil? A millimeter of movement at the muzzle is 10 meters of miss at 3 clicks. 6 seconds. Through the scope, the mirage danced, mocking her. The orange flashes of the enemy machine gun had stopped. The gunner was likely reloading, or perhaps he had heard the distant crack of her rifle and paused. 7 seconds. The bullet was dropping fast now, losing velocity, succumbing to gravity. It was entering the transonic zone, wobbling, searching for the target. 8 seconds. Finn leaned closer to his scope. Wait for it. Half a second later, through the magnified optics, the dark blob behind the white-hot barrel of the DSK abruptly snapped backward. A spray of dark mist, invisible to the naked eye but distinct through the high-powered glass, plumed into the grey air behind the sandbags. The heavy machine gun tilted violently upward, its front bipod collapsing as a heavy weight slumped against the spade grips. Splash, Finn breathed. He sounded shocked. He pulled his face away from the scope and looked at her, his jaw slack. Splash, target down, direct hit. Corinne didn't move. She kept the crosshairs trained on the bunker. Her hands were suddenly shaking. a fine, uncontrollable tremor in her fingers. The adrenaline dump was hitting her fast, making her stomach clench violently. She swallowed hard against the bile rising in her throat. "Confirm down?" she asked, her voice sounding thin and weak. "Confirmed," Finn said, getting back on the glass. "Gun is disabled or unmanned. Nobody is stepping up to take his place. They're panicking. I see movement in the trenches behind the bunker. They're trying to figure out where it came from." Carter scrambled over, abandoning his position to grab his radio. 2-6, this is Overwatch. Heavy gun is neutralized. I repeat, heavy gun is neutralized. You are clear to maneuver. Break contact and move to the secondary rally point. Go, go, go. There was a long pause of static, broken by the sound of boots on gravel and heavy breathing. "Copy Overwatch. We see it. We are moving. God damn, who the hell is up there?" Carter looked down at Corinne. She was slowly, painfully racking the bolt back. The huge, smoking brass casing ejected, tumbling onto the rock with a loud clink. She caught it before it could roll off the edge, shoving the hot brass into her dump pouch. It burned through her glove, but the pain grounded her. "Just an angel on your shoulder, 2-6, Carter said into the mic. "Keep moving." He dropped the radio and stared at Corinne. "I don't believe it." "Believe it," Finn said, packing up his kestrel with frantic, jerky motions. "Now let's get the hell out of here before they start dropping mortars on this grid square." "That echo practically gave them our zip code." Corinne nodded. She grabbed the rifle by the chassis, her muscles protesting every movement. The cold was seeping back in, replacing the adrenaline heat. Her knee throbbed. She felt pathetic, filthy, and entirely empty. There was no triumphant swell of music in her head, no chest-thumping pride. She had just ended a human life from 3 miles away to save a dozen others, and all she could think about was how badly she wanted a dry pair of wool socks and a hot cup of black coffee. "Let's move," Carter ordered, already crawling backward off the ledge. Corinne pushed herself up. The fog, thick and unyielding, swallowed the valley once more, hiding the aftermath, hiding the blood, hiding the impossible geometry of what had just occurred. She slung the heavy rifle over her back, feeling the titanium dig into her spine, and began the long, miserable climb down into the dark. Gravel crunched under the rubber soles of Corinne's boots, a sound that felt loud enough to wake the dead. The descent was worse than the climb. Going up, you fought gravity. Going down, you fought momentum, and gravity was actively trying to pull you into a jagged ravine. Every step sent a jarring shock up her shins, settling deep into her bad knee. The 30-pound .416 sniper rifle, slung across her back, shifted with a rhythmic, malicious thump against her vertebrae. She had wrapped the heavy canvas strap twice around her chest armor to keep it secure, but the chassis of the weapon still found the unpadded spaces between her plates. "Keep your spacing," Carter murmured over the localized comms, his voice a gravelly scrape. He was 10 meters ahead, a shapeless green mass slipping through the dense, wet fog. "They're going to start walking mortars up the slope any second." Corinne didn't answer. She was too busy negotiating a slick patch of shale. She planted her left foot sideways, digging the instep into the dirt, and leaned back. Her right hand gripped a wet, rotting pine root protruding from the rock face. The wood crumbled like wet cardboard under her glove. She dropped. It wasn't a graceful tactical slide. It was an ugly, desperate fall. Her hip slammed into a granite outcropping, scraping a long gouge across her tactical pants and taking a layer of skin with it. A sharp hiss escaped her teeth, swallowed instantly by the heavy mist. "Corey!" Finn's voice came over the headset, tight and breathless. He was somewhere behind her, dragging his own heavy load of spotter gear. "I'm fine," she grunted, pushing herself up with a bruised palm. Her hip throbbed, a hot, pulsing ache that matched the rhythm of her erratic heartbeat. "Just taking the fast route." Whoomp! The sound came from the valley floor. It was distinct, muffled by the fog, but unmistakable. The hollow cough of an 82mm mortar tube expelling a shell. "Incoming," Carter barked. "Find a hole." Corinne threw herself forward, ignoring the fiery pain in her leg. She wedged her body beneath a slanted slab of limestone, pressing her face into a bed of decaying ferns. The smell was overpowering: rotting vegetation, wet earth, and the sharp, metallic tang of her own nervous saliva. Finn scrambled down the slope seconds later, sliding in beside her, his breath coming in ragged, whistling heaves. 10 seconds passed. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. The earth shuddered. A deafening crack ripped through the air, vibrating against Corinne's teeth. The mortar shell had detonated somewhere above them, exactly on the ridge they had vacated less than 5 minutes ago. A shower of pulverized rock, shredded pine branches, and smoking shrapnel cascaded down the sheer cliff face, clattering harmlessly into the fog yards away. "Bracket," Finn whispered, his eyes wide behind his mud-splattered ballistic glasses. "They're bracketing the ridge. Next one goes lower." Whoomp, whoomp. 2 tubes this time. "Move," Carter ordered. "Down the draw, now." They didn't bother with stealth anymore. The enemy knew someone was on the mountain. They just didn't know exactly where. Corinne scrambled out from under the rock, her legs burning with lactic acid. They plunged into a steep, narrow ravine, carved by a millennia of runoff. The footing here was treacherous, a chaotic jumble of slick, moss-covered boulders and deep, muddy pits hidden beneath layers of dead leaves. She threw her weight forward, practically running in a controlled fall. Branches whipped her face, leaving stinging red welts across her cheek. The fog was thicker down here, pooling in the basin like sour milk. It was claustrophobic. She couldn't see Carter ahead of her, could only hear the heavy crashing of his boots and the rattling of his gear. Another pair of explosions rocked the mountainside, closer this time, high and to their left. The concussion squeezed Corinne's lungs, a brief, invisible fist punching her chest. The smell of high explosives, bitter, chemical and sharp, drifted down through the trees, mingling with the natural rot of the forest. "Almost at the tree line," Carter hissed over the comms. 2-6, Overwatch. "What is your status?" Static crackled in Corinne's ear, followed by a voice stretched thin by exhaustion and pain. "Overwatch 2-6. We are at Rally Point Bravo. We have 2 urgent surgicals. We are holding, but we are combat ineffective. We need an evac now." "Hold tight, 2-6. We are 3 mics out from your position." They pushed through the final cluster of dense pines, the steep incline abruptly leveling out into a wide, marshy depression. The fog hung lower here, a ceiling of grey just a few feet above their heads, leaving the ground relatively clear. Corinne paused, leaning heavily against a birch tree. Her thighs were shaking violently. She unclipped the bite valve of her hydration bladder and took a long drag. The water was lukewarm and tasted strongly of plastic and iodine, but it was the best thing she had ever swallowed. She let it sit in her mouth for a second before gulping it down, feeling it coat her raw throat. "Keep moving, Hayes," Carter said, passing her without slowing down. His face was a mask of dirt and grim determination, a jagged cut above his left eyebrow, weeping sluggishly. She pushed off the tree, ignoring the protests of her joints. They navigated the edge of the marsh, boots sinking ankle-deep into the dark, foul-smelling mud. The stench of stagnant water and decaying roots filled her nostrils. A shadow moved in the brush ahead. Corinne didn't think. Her exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a cold, immediate spike of adrenaline. She dropped her hand to her side, unclipping her sidearm, a customized SIG P226, and brought it up in a smooth, practiced arc. Beside her, Finn already had his M4 raised, the red dot sight hovering on the thicket. "Identify," Carter commanded, his own rifle locked into his shoulder. 2-6, a hoarse voice croaked from the bushes. A figure stepped out. He looked less like a Tier 1 operator and more like a survivor of a multi-car pileup. His uniform was torn, stained a deep rust brown across the abdomen. His helmet was gone, revealing a shock of matted blonde hair plastered to his forehead. He was leaning heavily on a shattered branch, his left leg dragging uselessly behind him. It was Sergeant Miller. Corinne had shared a lukewarm beer with him in a dusty tent, what felt like a lifetime ago. Miller squinted at them, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Carter, that you?" "It's me, Miller," Carter said, lowering his weapon and stepping forward to take the man's weight. "Where's the rest of your guys?" "In the hollow," Miller gasped, his head lolling onto Carter's shoulder. He smelled strongly of copper, unwashed skin, and the sickly sweet scent of burned flesh. Doc's trying to keep Jenkins together. Took a piece of a DSHK round through the plate carrier. Carter nodded sharply. "Finn, take his other side. Hayes, you're on point. Let's get him in." Roots, gnarled and thick as pythons, formed a natural overhang against the base of a massive limestone cliff. It was dark, damp, and smelled overwhelmingly of medical supplies. The sharp, chemical bite of quick-clot and the sterile sting of alcohol prep pads clashing violently with the odors of mud and human misery. Corinne stepped into the hollow, her pistol still drawn, sweeping the dark corners before holstering it. 6 men were crammed into the tight space. 3 were sitting against the rock wall, their faces blank, eyes staring at nothing. 1 was frantically working over a prone figure in the center of the dirt floor. "Doc incoming," Carter announced quietly, hauling Miller into the cave with Finn's help. The medic, a wiry guy named Henderson, didn't look up. His hands were buried in the chest of the man on the ground, packing gauze into a ragged, bubbling hole. "Put him by the wall. Keep his legs elevated. I'll get to him in a minute." Corinne backed away, giving them room. She found an empty patch of dirt near the entrance and practically collapsed. She unclasped the heavy waist belt of her pack, letting it drop to the floor with a dull thud. Next came the chest rig, then the helmet. The cool cave air hit her damp scalp, a fleeting moment of relief that made her shiver violently. She brought the massive .416 around, laying it carefully across her lap. It was covered in grit, the scope lenses smudged with dirty water. She pulled a microfiber cloth from a zippered pocket on her sleeve and began wiping down the bolt, her movements slow and mechanical. A shadow fell over her. She looked up. Lieutenant Davies, the officer in charge of Echo 26, was standing over her. His face was a patchwork of soot and minor lacerations, his eyes bloodshot and ringed with deep, purple exhaustion. He looked at Corinne, then at the massive rifle resting on her thighs, and then back at her face. "Carter said you were up on the ridge," Davies said. His voice was low, scraped raw by shouting over gunfire. "We were," Corinne replied, not stopping her cleaning. She buffed a smudge off the objective lens of her optic. "That shot—" Davies trailed off, shaking his head. He squatted down, wincing as his knees popped. "The DSHK had us pinned behind a crumbling berm. It was eating the stone alive. 10 more seconds, and it would have chewed right through to us." Jenkins took a ricochet right as the gun stopped. He stared at the dirt, picking up a handful and letting it sift through his filthy fingers. I didn't hear a crack, just saw the gunner's head snap back and the weapon went dead, like somebody unplugged it. Physics, Corinne said softly. Supersonic travel, transonic transition. Flight time was over 8 seconds. The sound hadn't reached you yet. Davies looked at her, a strange mixture of awe and deep, unsettling discomfort in his eyes. It was a look Corinne was intimately familiar with. It was the look infantrymen gave snipers. They were grateful, desperately grateful, but they also recognized the cold, mathematical detachment required to do what she did. To them, combat was chaotic, close, and loud. It was blood in your eyes and the screaming of the man next to you. To her, it was wind calls, barometric pressure, and a quiet, clinical squeeze of a trigger from a different zip code. 3 clicks, Davies muttered, almost to himself. Nobody makes that shot. Nobody. The wind died, she lied. It was easier than explaining the updraft and the Coriolis effect. Let them think it was luck. It made her seem less like a machine. Well, Davies said, pushing himself back up to his feet. He reached out and awkwardly patted her shoulder. You saved my squad, Hayes. Thank you. Just doing the job, LT, she replied, her voice flat. He nodded slowly, lingering for a moment before turning back to his wounded men. Corinne watched him go. She didn't feel like a savior. She just felt hollowed out. Her knee was throbbing a steady, agonizing rhythm. Her boots were sodden prisons of cold misery. She looked down at the rifle in her lap. It was just a tool. Titanium, steel, and glass. It didn't care about the lives it saved, or the life it had violently ended. Finn slumped down on the dirt beside her, groaning as his back hit the rock wall. He pulled off his gloves, his hands red and shaking. He dug into one of his pouches and pulled out a crushed, half-eaten protein bar. He broke it in half and held a piece out to her. Breakfast of champions, he muttered. Corinne took it. It was rock hard, tasting faintly of chalk and stale chocolate. It was awful. You okay? Finn asked quietly, not looking at her. He was staring out the cave entrance, watching the grey fog swirl among the trees. My boots are wet, she said. Finn let out a short, humourless laugh. Yeah, mine too. How long until evac? She asked, chewing the dry protein bar, forcing her saliva to break it down. Carter's talking to the birds now. Weather is supposed to lift in an hour. If the fog clears, they'll bring a pave hawk in. If not... Finn shrugged, a jagged movement. If not, we start walking. And with Miller and Jenkins, we're not going to get far. Corinne swallowed the chalky mass in her mouth. She reached down and began loosening the laces of her left boot. She needed to let her feet breathe, just for a few minutes, before the inevitable swelling locked the leather tight around her ankles forever. They won't leave us, Corinne said, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was trying to convince. She finally managed to pry the boot off. The smell was horrendous. Swamp water, old sweat, and the sharp tang of a ruptured blister. The cold air hit her damp wool sock, sending a shiver violently up her spine. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on her uninjured knee, staring out into the oppressive grey void. She had made the impossible shot. The brass would probably pin a medal on her chest if they ever got back. They would write a citation full of words like valor and precision and unwavering resolve. But sitting here in the freezing mud, listening to the wet, agonizing breaths of a dying man 10 feet away, Corinne Hayes knew the truth. There was no glory in the math. There was only the bullet, the target, and the crushing, suffocating wait for the fog to clear. Time didn't pass in the hollow. It stagnated. Minutes stretched into agonizing hours, measured only by the rhythmic, wet rasp of Jenkins fighting for air. He was lying on a torn piece of thermal foil, his skin the color of old parchment. Doc Henderson had stopped packing gauze 20 minutes ago. Now he just sat beside the wounded man, a blood-soaked rag held uselessly in his limp hand, staring blankly at the mud. Corinne watched a single drop of water gather on a pale root above her head. It swelled, trembling with the weight of its own mass, before detaching and hitting the dirt with a dull smack. "How many rounds do you have left?" Carter's voice was a harsh whisper, breaking the suffocating silence. He was crouched by the cave entrance, his rifle resting on a mossy boulder, peering into the thinning grey soup. "5 in the gun," Corinne replied, not looking up from her boots. She had relaced the left one, the swollen flesh of her ankle protesting the tight leather. 10 in reserve, their armor-piercing incendiary, not exactly meant for close quarters. "If they push this hollow, we won't have a choice," Carter said grimly. Finn let out a long, ragged sigh, shifting his weight against the stone wall. "Using a .416 in a cave. We're all going to be deaf before we're dead." He wasn't wrong. The overpressure from that massive cartridge in an enclosed space would rupture their eardrums, turning their brains to jelly before the enemy even got close enough to use bayonets. But Corinne didn't reach for her pistol. She kept the heavy sniper rifle across her lap, her thumb resting lightly on the safety. The temperature was dropping again. The fog outside was beginning to shred, tearing into wispy, localized patches as a cold front pushed down from the peaks. Visibility was improving. That was the paradox of their situation. Clear skies meant the pavehawk could fly, but it also meant the enemy could see the muddy tracks they had left all the way down the ravine. A sharp, metallic click echoed from the tree line. Corinne froze, every muscle in her body locked tight. Beside her, Finn slowly brought his M4 up, his face pale and slick with oily grime. Even Jenkins seemed to stop gasping. It was the sound of a bolt carrier group slamming forward on an AK pattern rifle. Metal on metal, unmistakable. "Contact!" Davies hissed from the back of the cave, his voice cracking. He struggled to raise his own weapon, his injured arm trembling violently. "Hold your fire," Carter ordered, his tone flat and utterly devoid of panic. "Let them get out of the trees. We shoot now. We just hit wood." Corinne slid her body sideways, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in her hip. She crab-walked toward the mouth of the cave, finding a narrow gap between 2 jagged rocks. She shoved the heavy barrel of the .416 through the opening, the cold steel scraping against limestone. Through the optic, the world was a messy blur of brown and grey. She dialed the magnification down to its lowest setting, turning the precision instrument into an oversized, terribly unbalanced battle rifle. Shadows moved among the birch trunks, not just 1 or 2, a dozen. They were fanning out, their movements disciplined, cautious. They wore woodland camouflage that blended perfectly with the rotting vegetation, their faces smeared with dark grease. They were tracking the boot prints right to the edge of the marsh. Corinne's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, erratic rhythm that made her hands shake. This wasn't her element. She was a ghost. She operated miles away, detached from the consequences of her trigger pull by distance and optics. Now she could see the whites of their eyes. She could see the breath pluming from their mouths. 50 meters, Carter whispered. "Wait for the marsh. Make them cross the open ground." A tall fighter with a scarred chest rig, stepped out from the cover of a massive oak. He looked down at the mud, studying the deep impressions left by Corinne and Finn carrying Miller. He raised his hand, signaling the men behind him. He pointed directly at the hollow. "They made us," Finn said, his voice tight. "Take the point, man," Carter ordered Corinne. "On my mark." She settled the crosshairs on the center of the man's chest. At this range, there was no math, no wind call, just point and shoot. It felt wrong. It felt profoundly ugly. "Mark!" Corinne pulled the trigger. The blast was catastrophic. Inside the rock overhang, the concussion was a physical blow to the head. Corinne's vision swam, black spots dancing in the corners of her eyes. Her ears didn't ring, they simply ceased to function, replaced by a dull, throbbing pressure. Through the smoke pouring from the muzzle brake, she saw the point man simply vanish. The massive .416 round didn't just pierce him, it disassembled him, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the brush in a spray of crimson and shattered gear. The tree line erupted. Gunfire tore into the hollow, chipping limestone and sending a shower of jagged splinters raining down on them. Tracers zipped through the damp air, bright green streaks of violence that hissed like angry hornets. Corinne frantically worked the bolt, her palms slapping the handle up and back. The brass casing ejected, pinging sharply off the roof of the cave and landing hot against her neck. She didn't flinch. She shoved the bolt forward, chambering another massive round. She couldn't hear the gunfire. She could only feel it. The vibrations shuddered through the rock, rattling her teeth. Carter and Finn were laying down suppressive fire, their M4s barking in short, controlled bursts. Brass piled up around their knees. Corinne forced her eye back behind the scope. The magnification was disorienting at this range. She saw a patch of camo, a muzzle flash, a screaming mouth. She didn't think. She just fired. The recoil punched her shoulder, grinding the bruised tissue against her armor plate. Another man went down, his chest cavity caved in by the sheer kinetic energy of the bullet. But there were too many of them. They were spreading out, flanking the marsh, using the dense ferns for cover. A burst from an RPK heavy machine gun chewed into the dirt inches from Corinne's face, kicking wet mud into her eyes. She blinked frantically, tears blurring her vision as she ripped the heavy rifle away from the gap. "I'm blind!" she screamed, though she couldn't even hear her own voice. She dropped the sniper rifle. It was useless now. Too slow, too clumsy. She drew her P226 sidearm, scrubbing her left hand across her face to clear the mud. A shape lunged through the cave entrance. He was young, terrified, moving purely on adrenaline. He swung a short-barreled AK toward Finn's back. Corinne didn't aim. She pointed the pistol and pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. The heavy 9mm hollow points caught the man in the side, spinning him into the rock wall. He slid down, leaving a thick, dark smear against the limestone. The air inside the hollow was unbreathable. It tasted of sulfur, vaporized lead, and copper. Corinne's lungs burned. Her knee was screaming, the joint stiff and swollen, but she pushed herself up into a crouch, pivoting toward the opening. Then, the ground vibrated. It wasn't the sharp, erratic shudder of mortar fire. It was a deep, rhythmic thumping that seemed to push the very air out of the valley. Thwack, 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 thwack. Through the ringing in her ears, Corinne felt the distinct, concussive pressure of rotor blades. The trees outside the cave suddenly bent backward, whipped into a frenzy by a localized hurricane. The remaining fog was blasted away in swirling, chaotic vortexes, an MH60, Pavehawk descended into the marsh like an angry, mechanical god. It didn't land. It hovered 3 feet above the muck, its twin miniguns already spinning. A deafening, continuous roar erupted from the chopper. A solid stream of tracers poured into the tree line, vaporizing bark, branches, and flesh with terrifying efficiency. The enemy fire ceased instantly, replaced by the screams of men being shredded by 4,000 rounds a minute. "Move!" Carter roared, grabbing Corinne by the shoulder harness and hauling her toward the exit. "We need to carry Jenkins," Doc Henderson screamed back, his hands completely slick with blood. Corinne holstered her pistol. She grabbed the front handle of the thermal foil Jenkins was lying on. Finn grabbed the other side. "On 3, Finn gasped, his face grey. 1, 2, 3! They lifted. Jenkins was dead weight, his body entirely slack. He groaned, a wet, horrifying sound that cut right through the noise of the helicopter. They dragged him out of the cave. The rotor wash hit them like a physical wall, throwing freezing mud and stagnant water directly into their faces. Corinne leaned into the wind, her boots slipping in the muck, every muscle in her back screaming in protest. The para-rescue men in the back of the Pavehawk were already on the skids, reaching out. "Come on!" one of them yelled, his voice barely audible over the turbines. Corinne threw herself forward, practically shoving Jenkins onto the metal floor of the cabin. A pair of gloved hands grabbed the wounded man, hauling him inside. Finn went next, stumbling over the skid, collapsing onto the deck. Corinne turned back. Carter was dragging Miller, the injured sergeant hopping painfully on one leg, leaning heavily on the team leader. The tree line was completely suppressed, the miniguns still chewing the forest to splinters, but a stray AK round cracked against the fuselage of the chopper, sparking violently. She didn't get into the bird. She planted her feet in the mud, grabbed Miller's tactical vest, and heaved backward with everything she had left. Her bad knee buckled, sending a white-hot spike of agony straight to her brain. But she didn't let go. She hauled Miller over the lip of the cabin, falling backward onto the non-slip flooring as he tumbled in on top of her. Carter dove in right behind them. "Go! Go! Go!" he screamed, hammering his fist against the bulkhead. The Pavehawk banked hard and pitched its nose down, the engines howling as it tore up and away from the marsh. Corinne lay on her back on the freezing metal floor, staring up at the chaotic tangle of wires and hydraulic lines on the ceiling. The cabin smelled strongly of aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and raw, fresh blood. The medic was already hovering over Jenkins, tearing open a fresh trauma kit. She slowly turned her head. Her .416 sniper rifle was not strapped to her chest. She had left it in the dirt of the hollow, abandoning the $15,000 piece of custom hardware to the mud and the dead. She didn't care. She closed her eyes. The vibration of the floor plates seeped into her bones. Her hip throbbed, her knee was on fire, and her hands were coated in a sticky mixture of mud and someone else's blood. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her chest trembling uncontrollably as the adrenaline finally, totally abandoned her. She wasn't a machine. She wasn't a hero. She was just incredibly, painfully human, and she was going home. Vibrations from the twin turboshaft engines rattled Corinne's molars, sending a constant numb hum through her skull. She lay flat on the grooved aluminum decking, her eyes locked on the chaotic tangle of hydraulic lines running along the ceiling. JP-8 aviation fuel filled the cabin with a noxious chemical stench that burned the back of her throat, completely overwhelming the metallic tang of the trauma unfolding just 3 feet away. Doc Henderson was fighting a frantic, losing battle. He knelt over Jenkins in the center of the bay, his knees slipping in a dark puddle that was rapidly spreading across the non-slip flooring. A flight medic had joined him, shouting measurements and heart rates over the deafening scream of the rotors. They were shoving tubes into Jenkins's chest, packing combat gauze into the jagged hole the ricochet had torn through his ribs. Corinne watched them without really seeing them. Her vision was tunneled, the edges of the world grey and indistinct. The adrenaline that had carried her up the mountain, through the impossible shot, and out of the hollow was gone. In its place was a heavy, suffocating emptiness. Carter sat slumped against the opposite bulkhead, his helmet wedged between his knees. His uniform was ripped from the shoulder down to the elbow, revealing a long, ugly gash that had finally stopped bleeding, sealed by dirt and cold air. He wasn't looking at Jenkins. He was staring at his own boots, his jaw locked tight, muscles twitching rhythmically in his cheek. Finn was curled into a tight ball near the tail ramp. He had his hands pressed hard over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut. He looked like a frightened child, stripped of the sarcastic armor he wore so perfectly back at the base. Minutes stretched into an eternity of noise and cold. Altitude sucked the remaining heat from the cabin, turning the dampness in Corinne's uniform to ice. She shivered violently, her teeth clicking together in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. She couldn't stop it. Her central nervous system was misfiring, short-circuiting after 72 hours of hypervigilance and sheer physical trauma. Changes in pitch signaled their descent. The Pavehawk banked sharply, the G-forces pressing Corinne heavily into the floor plates. Outside the open doors, the pitch-black sky gave way to the harsh, glaring halogen lights of the forward operating base. Wheels hit the tarmac with a violent, jarring thud that sent a fresh spike of fire through Corinne's swollen knee. Before the aircraft even fully settled on its struts, the flight medic was kicking the side doors open. Chaos erupted instantly. A medical triage team sprinted across the concrete, pushing a collapsible gurney. They hit the cabin in a swarm of sterile gloves, high-visibility vests, and shouted acronyms. Jenkins was hoisted onto the litter, the foil blanket sliding off to reveal his waxen, bloodless face. They wheeled him away in a frantic sprint toward the surgical tent, Henderson jogging right alongside them, his hands still pressed desperately against Jenkins's chest. Corinne forced herself to sit up. Her joints screamed in protest. She felt like an 80-year-old woman trapped in a frozen, battered shell. "Let's go," Carter croaked, pushing himself off the wall. He stumbled, his bad leg giving out for a fraction of a second before he caught his balance against the doorframe. "Clear the bird. They need to wash the deck." She grabbed the frame and hauled herself down onto the tarmac. Solid ground felt wrong. It didn't sway, it didn't vibrate, and it was entirely too bright. The floodlights around the helipad burned her retinas, forcing her to squint through gritty, dirt-crusted eyelashes. Base personnel were already swarming the helicopter. Mechanics with flashlights inspecting the fuselage for bullet holes, fueling crews dragging heavy hoses, and a young corporal holding a clipboard who looked utterly terrified by the state of the team standing before him. Davies emerged from the cabin, supporting Miller. The lieutenant looked destroyed. He didn't say a word to Carter or Corinne. He just nodded grimly, gripping Miller tighter, and began the slow, agonizing limp toward the medical annex. Corinne stood alone on the concrete. She reached over her shoulder, her hand instinctively seeking the familiar, heavy contour of the titanium chassis. Nothing was there. Her fingers brushed against the empty nylon webbing of her retention strap. The .416, the massive piece of custom-machined artillery she had carried up that miserable mountain, was sitting in a puddle of freezing mud 30 miles away. It was gone. Leave it, Finn muttered, materializing beside her. He looked awful. His pale eyes were bloodshot, and he had a dark smear of grease painted across his forehead. Quartermaster is going to throw a fit, but screw him. It's just metal. I know, she said. Her voice cracked, dry and useless. Come on, Finn said, gently hooking his fingers under the strap of her tactical vest. Let's get out of this gear before it fuses to our skin. They walked toward the team room in silence. The base was alive around them, diesel trucks grinding gears, generators humming, the distant muffled thumping of artillery, firing illumination rounds into the mountains. It was the machinery of war, vast and impersonal, completely oblivious to the brutal, intimate violence they had just survived. Steam billowed through the corrugated tin roof of the shower block, clinging to the cold mirrors and pooling on the slick, mouldy tiles. The water pressure was pathetic, a weak, sputtering stream of lukewarm water that smelled strongly of chlorine. But to Corinne, it felt like salvation. She stood perfectly still beneath the showerhead, letting the water turn brown as it stripped away layers of pulverized granite, cordite residue, and dried mud. She watched the dark, filthy slurry swirl down the aluminum drain, fascinated by the sheer volume of grime she had carried off the mountain. Peeling off her gear had been an agonizing process. Her tactical pants were essentially glued to her legs by dried swamp water. Taking off her left boot had required cutting the laces with a tactical knife. Her ankle was swollen to the size of a grapefruit, mottled with ugly yellow and purple bruising. Now, stripped bare, the physical cost of the operation was impossible to ignore. Corinne traced 2 fingers over her right collarbone. A massive, deep purple bruise bloomed across her shoulder, the exact shape and size of the .416's recoil pad. It throbbed with a dull, sickening heat. Her hip was raw meat, scraped perfectly clean of skin from her fall down the ravine. Every muscle fiber in her back felt like it had been shredded and haphazardly stitched back together. She grabbed a bar of cheap, institutional soap and began scrubbing. The lye stung the open cuts on her hands, but she welcomed the sharp bite of pain. It was clean. It was grounding. She scrubbed until her skin was raw and pink, trying to erase the smell of the hollow. The rot, the copper, the metallic tang of the heavy machine gun rounds. It didn't work. The smell wasn't on her skin. It was lodged somewhere deep in her sinuses, permanently burned into her olfactory memory. 20 minutes later, Corinne pushed through the heavy canvas door of the team room. She wore clean grey sweatpants and a faded black t-shirt, limping heavily on her bad knee. Her wet hair clung to the back of her neck. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed annoyingly overhead, casting a harsh, sterile light over the rows of metal lockers and folding tables. Finn was sitting on a plastic crate in the corner, staring at a styrofoam cup of coffee. He had showered, but he didn't look clean. He looked hollowed out. "Jenkins is in surgery," Finn said, without looking up as she limped past him. "Surgeon said the bullet deflected off his backplate, tumbled and clipped his lung. They don't know if he'll make it through the night." Corinne stopped. She placed both hands flat on the cold metal of a folding table, leaning her weight off her throbbing ankle. "And Miller?" "Shattered femur. He's getting airlifted to Ramstein in the morning. His war is over." She nodded slowly. There was nothing to say. No platitudes could fix the brutal arithmetic of the casualty report. Carter walked out of the commander's office at the far end of the room. He had a fresh bandage taped over his eyebrow, and he was holding a green military folder. He looked older than he had 3 days ago. The deep lines around his mouth had settled into permanent trenches. He walked over and dropped the folder onto the table in front of Corinne. "After action report," Carter said, pulling out a chair and collapsing into it. Commander wants it signed by 0600. They're already calling it a textbook Overwatch execution. Corinne stared at the manila folder. Textbook. We abandoned a $15,000 primary weapon system in hostile territory, almost got overrun by a patrol, and Echo 26 got chewed to pieces. What part of that is textbook, Mitch? Carter sighed, rubbing his face with both hands. The part where you hit a DSHK gunner through a rolling fog bank at 3,000 meters. The brass is losing their minds over the telemetry data. Finn's ballistic logs are being transmitted to Naval Special Warfare Command right now. They want to put a medal on you, Hayes. I don't want a medal, she snapped, the anger flaring hot and sudden in her chest. I want to sleep for a week. I want my knee to stop throbbing. I want to forget what Jenkins sounded like when we dragged him into the dirt. You don't get to forget, Carter said, his voice dropping low, losing the command edge. It was just the exhausted murmur of a man who carried his own ghosts. None of us do. That's not the deal we signed. He pushed the folder closer to her. You pulled the trigger, Corinne. You did the math. You made the impossible happen, and because you did, Davies and 5 other guys are breathing base air right now, instead of bleeding out in that valley. The rifle is gone. Jenkins is in God's hands, but you did your job. Corinne looked away from him. She looked at her hands. They were raw, pink, and completely empty. The tremor had finally stopped, replaced by a deep, heavy stillness. She knew Carter was right. The logic was sound. The math balanced out. 1 life taken at 3 miles, 6 saved in the mud. But logic didn't warm the freezing void in her chest. Logic didn't erase the memory of the heavy crosshairs resting exactly 3 mils left of a human being, and the violent, unforgiving roar of the rifle breaking the silence. Finn stood up from his crate. He walked over, setting his untouched styrofoam cup down next to the manila folder. Drink it, Finn said softly. It tastes like battery acid and despair, but it's hot. Corinne looked at the coffee, then at Finn's exhausted, loyal eyes. She reached out, her fingers wrapping around the warm, flimsy foam of the cup. She wasn't a legend. She wasn't the heroic sniper the brass would write about in their sanitized reports. She was just Corinne Hayes. Tired, broken, incredibly flawed, and surviving 1 breath at a time in the quiet, unforgiving aftermath. She picked up the pen, uncapped it, and signed her name on the dotted line. Did Corinne's impossible shot leave you breathless? The physical toll, the brutal math, the sheer will to pull the trigger. This is what real operations look like when the safety nets are gone. If you want to dive deeper into the raw, unfiltered realities of tactical storytelling, hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates grounded military drama, and subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of the action. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the shot?